Hey everyone. Welcome to episode 9. Lily Consuelo Saporta Tagiuri. I can't believe it's been almost 2 months since I launched Meet Me at the Through Line. I'm so thankful for all the guests I've interviewed so far and everyone out there listening to the podcast. I'm excited to continue connecting with people from different walks of life, building this podcast, and seeing where it all goes. One clarification in this episode. At the time of the recording of this episode, I was living in northern New Mexico, and I told Lily about an arroyo that was nearby. She asked me what an arroyo is, and I told her an arroyo is a river and means river in Spanish. But according to the New Mexico Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources, because I Googled Arroyo, New Mexico, and this is one of the first websites that came up, an arroyo is a Spanish term for stream, but in the Southwest, the term is commonly applied to stream beds that are dry most of the time. So there you go. All right, let's get into this episode. Lily is an ecosystemic designer, eco-futurist, and cook. At the beginning of the episode, I asked her what she means when she says she creates ecosystemic tools, and that question eventually leads us to talking about making things with our hands. We move on to talking about futurisms, and then her seed, foraging, cooking, and oven making projects, which are so cool. And I'm not just saying that, I'm serious. What she's sharing is amazing. And I really encourage you to, check out her work. I know many of us have busy lives, busy schedules, but to take a pause and look at her website, scroll through her Instagram, just take some time to sink into what she's sharing. Then we end up talking about tide pools on the east and west coast of the US, and then pivot to her perspective on the current state of the world. Closer to the end of the episode, Lily shares more about her father, John Tagiuri, who recently passed away, and carrying on his legacy. And then we end with her reflections on finding joy in small moments. I love how Lily thinks and creates in general, especially when it comes to food and cooking. I've been following her work for a few years, but I've never been to one of her events or meals in person. I would love to go to one of her meals one day. Lily's practice is chock full of really cool ideas. For example, we talk about working with the sun through her collaborative project called Solstice Kitchen, her love for making ovens, and a brief mention of solar punk. So that part of the conversation actually inspired me to want to create a DIY solar oven, and I'm currently gathering all the materials I need to make this oven. Food is a relatable approach to work with because most, if not all of us, eat. And it's such a powerful medium to spark connection and bring people together. Lily's work shows how much of a creative force culinary art can be when it comes to meeting people, starting conversations, dreaming, and creating new realities. She doesn't just focus on cooking, though. Her experiences with creating a seed library and foraging along coastlines in Greece and France, both of which you'll learn more about in the episode, are also in the mix. I'm extremely drawn to all of this because I'm interested in foods, medicines, and beauty practices that come from or are connected to the ocean. And yeah, I can't wait to see what else Lily explores as time goes on. Before I say more, here is her bio. Lily Consuelo Saporta Tagiuri is an ecosystemic designer and eco-futurist whose practice is aimed at public engagement, ecological equity, and joy. Her work addresses emerging climates and conditions of cities specifically pertaining to clean water, food sovereignty, fresh air, and green space. Through the construction of ecosystemic tools, material experimentation, collaborations, and installations, she responds to the ecological circumstances we are collectively contending with. Her work has been shown internationally, and she has worked with numerous clients, partners, and collaborators, all of whom you can learn more about in her bio that is on her website and her episode page on Substack. Some reflections from this episode. Being a maker. Lily talks about growing up making things, being raised in a family where making is appreciated, and making things with her hands being a language. Now, this is a language I wish I grew up learning, but at the tender age of 33, I know it's not too late. I want to start making more. I want to make cakes. I've been really inspired to make cakes because I've been watching this baking show with one of my sisters and my niece. I want to cook more. I want to sew. Like, I've always wanted to sew and design my own clothes. And yeah, I just want to see what can I make, what feels good. If I'm honest, I don't really do much with my hands right now except type and scroll and flip the pages of a few books I'm reading. And I feel like my sense of agency, or I don't know what it is, in making things is numb or has atrophied a bit. Maybe blame a little bit of it on technology. So speaking with Lily has really inspired me to connect with my hands more. I know I keep talking about being a Gemini moon in my natal chart, but in my experience as an air moon, I know that I'm really comfortable in the airy, cerebral way of processing information, which I think is totally fine. That's part of, that's one dimension of Gemini. And, every sign has its way of being in the world, its way of expressing itself. Every sign has its gifts and things it can improve on. But a big part, at least for me, being a Gemini moon and air moon, is learning how to integrate information, embody my ideas and interests, and intentionally connect with my body because it's easy and comfortable in that airy cerebral space. I love it. I'm glad that I'm comfortable there. But since I'm in a body and I live in a body 24/7, I think it will be helpful to translate all the airy information into earthly flesh and experience. I hope this makes sense. Is there anything you, dear listeners, like to make or want to make? Seed collecting, foraging, cooking meals, and making ovens. There's something so beautiful about Lily's experiences collecting seeds of edible halophytes, also known as salt-tolerant plants, from a coastline, if I'm correct, in Athens, Greece, foraging different kinds of edible seaweeds in the west of France, building a small-scale desalinator, cooking creative meals that connect to different environments in such poetic, provocative, and I'm sure delicious ways, and being passionate about making ovens. I told Lily I never met anyone who's passionate about making ovens. And I know I'm saying that this is all beautiful, but what I'm saying is that there's so much beauty like underlying and embedded in what she's sharing, at least to me. And I don't know if other people feel that way, people who know Lily more, or, if Lily herself feels that way. Shout out to you, Lily. You're dope. Yeah, I'm not sure if she's purposely responding to the times with beauty, but that's what it feels like to me, that, there's a lot going on in the world, and there's something about beauty in her work. Like, you're addressing freshwater scarcity, or you're contemplating the future of food and food sovereignty, and you share or deliver your ideas in different ways, but there's also this element of beauty. And you know what? Beauty is a force also. Beauty, beauty has a stake. If that makes sense. There's something about beauty and beauty can be expressed in all different kinds of ways. But that's just me. That's how I feel about what Lily shares, Yeah, beauty. Shout out to sharing beauty. And I don't, you know, I'm not like, I think that's just what happens when she creates based on what I've observed. I don't know. I don't know if it's like, I don't know if people, like, there's another person who makes herbal medicines. Okay. Dr. Jackie from Salish Medicines, her herbal medicines are gorgeous. Oh my God, overflowing with beauty. I think she's also a Taurus moon. Um, and it's like, I'm not sure if folks are like trying to do this. I think it just happens. Um, which goes back to, being yourself, tapping into yourself and seeing what happens when you connect to yourself and your ideas. Futurisms. Lily is an eco-futurist. I've explored and written about water futurisms in New York City and the Southwest before. We are both futurists. I enjoy learning about all the different kinds of futurisms that exist out there. Asking Lily about her perspective on futurisms is probably one of the biggest questions I wanted to ask anyone who intentionally calls themselves a futurist. In the collectives, sometimes, oftentimes, the future tends to be put in quotation marks and dismissed. That's how I feel. And I don't really understand why the future, kind of gets picked on. Or why, it just feels like the future, like people are ganging up on the future. And I personally feel there's interesting culture making around comparing time where the present is positioned as being better than the future. And the past, well, for many people, it doesn't matter. It's not as important. Um, it's not a priority, whatever, all the things. It's interesting what dimensions of time people are comfortable with and how we can sometimes maybe unintentionally try to disempower one dimension of time in order to uplift another dimension as the one that makes more sense. I understand the past, present, and future as one and the same. And I didn't even have to say it that way. I could have said, I understand the future, past, and present as one and the same. I'll never forget being in a big Zoom call with this project. I don't know if it's still going, but it's called Afrotectopia. And I attended one of their events, and I don't know how many people was on this Zoom call. And I can't remember if it was, the the speakers who were talking about futurisms or someone in the audience. But the conversation was about the future. And I remember someone in this big crowd of Zoom attendees shouting out, "The future is now." And I don't know, it was just kind of cool because it was just the way that they said it. Like, we're online, we're in this Zoom room, but when they said it, it actually felt like we were in a crowd of people and someone was like, "The future is now." And that has always been an echo in my memory. That's always stayed with me. So I think it's interesting to observe how people, places, communities, cultures, and other than human kin understand and embody time. I'm a bit of a conspiracy theorist when it comes to the future. I have a still forming conspiracy theory on why, why, like, why I think folks are not only encouraged to think less, talk less, and dream less about the future, but it feels like, I don't know, it just feels like people are being turned against, quote, the future. I don't know why, quote, the future. There seems to be tension between being present and thinking about the future, which I can understand that tension. I also think that it's possible to do both. Maybe not at the exact same time, but I think it's possible to live a life of deep presence and to honor and revere presence and be devoted to presence and it just be a practice. Like we don't have to bash ourselves over the head if we suddenly find that we're not being present, but just you know, it, it, you know, it being a practice. But we can also engage with the future. We can think about the future. We can talk about the future. Imagine the future. We can do meditations, creative activities, like living a life of presence doesn't have to like cancel out having a relationship with the future or talking about it. We can actually be connected to all dimensions of time. The future, the past, the present, all be in between space-time dimensions. I don't have to choose, and I don't want to choose. You don't have to choose. I think it's just a matter of feeling out how these dimensions of time, how they show up in our bodies and if you find that you get anxiety over the future, fear, or you start future tripping, that doesn't mean, in my opinion, that the response to that reaction is to make the future bad. And now something's wrong with the future. I think it's more about how can, I think it's perhaps connected to addressing the anxiety and the fear, the future tripping. I hope that makes sense. It's going to be different for everyone. We're not cookie cutter out here. We are not a cookie cutter. No. So I meandered there a little bit. I hope that made sense. I just feel really passionate because as a futurist, I just feel like metaphorically, I'll be in a room where I didn't tell anyone I was a futurist, but everyone's like bashing futurisms and I don't say nothing. And I just don't understand. I don't understand. I'm gonna recircle back to this in like a minute. Well, I'm gonna recircle back to this, but I just want to say I really appreciate Lily sharing how people think about and create the future in everyday, small, mundane moments. Many folks make shopping lists to buy groceries, or not. You go to the store, you just find whatever. People, families plan a bowling night or a birthday party or some kind of outing on a particular day. Your everyday futurism. We all engage in future making on micro to macro scales. in episode 7, this is me returning back to the point I wanted to make earlier. I interviewed Danny Mercury, who is an herbalist, and they talked about the ecological role of wetlands. Lily and I talk a little bit about that in regards to the role of people who identify as futurists / whose work primarily focuses on futurisms. I think what's really important to mention, and I might not articulate this well, is that thinking about the future and creating the future isn't just something that artists and activists do. I believe large businesses and the government all engage in futurisms. There are people, whether it's explicitly named or not, who are paid to think about the future and how it pertains to their project, organization, business, political agendas. And, I don't have a lot of research to back this up, but I bet you there are tons of papers, panels, recorded panels, academic journals that have researched, how there are larger players in the world who are engaging in futurisms and shaping the future. I'm sure it's out there. We can all contribute to personal and collective futures, whether that's in a few hours, except the sun, tomorrow, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 50 years from now. In that same vein, I wonder for those whose ecological role I wonder for those whose ecological role is to tend to communicate and collaborate with and catalyze futures in different ways. I wonder what these folks will be sharing in the coming years. What a time to be thinking about futurisms, like in this moment right now, with all that's going on in the country. What a time to be thinking about futures, possible futures of just next week. I recently saw in Lily's IG stories that Imprudence, a foresight and speculative design studio based in Paris, France, which imagines new futures, I'll link them in the show notes, describes Lily as someone who will redefine the next decade. And you know what? I believe it. All right, listeners, if you can / want to, please take your time listening to this episode. Make a cup of tea at home, find a cozy cafe, or listen on the go. Either way, I hope you find at least one thing in this episode that is interesting, sparks your curiosity, is helpful, or inspiring in some way. Until next time. Welcome to the podcast, Lily. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me. I'm in a sunny room in my studio and feeling like spring is gonna make things easier.
I hear you. Yeah, I love spring. Love the flowers. I don't know. Everything's coming alive. That sounds great. So we're gonna jump right in. Like I told you before we pressed record, I'm really excited to interview you and just be in conversation because I just love how you think and create. So in your bio, you say that you are an ecosystemic designer. I hope I said that right. An eco-futurist. What do you mean by this?
So these are two terms that I gave myself. So ecosystemic design is the design of objects and experiences that are integrated with ecological systems rather than centering the human. They're looking at every other component of a space or a community or an ecosystem. So the waterways, the non-human actors, and I'm coming from a background where humans are very centered and the idea of human-centric design is celebrated. Um, but I found that there were a lot of shortcomings in that design discipline that could really be improved with sort of an outlook of uh, interconnectedness. And so that's where the word ecosystemic design came from, that title. And then eco-futurist is the other title that I've given myself to describe the work that I do in imagining the futures that we desire, not just the ones that we fear, predicated on ecological systems as well. So a lot of the work is thinking about what we can collectively create or imagine and then bring into being and not feel limited just by the constraints of today. So I find that featuring conversations is really useful in freeing ourselves from the parameters that we might give ourselves on a day to day, like political or economic or social constraints that do shift over time. What if some of those were non-existent? And what would they look like if they were our wildest dreams and our wildest versions of those um, realities? And I also use it as a tool to not become too nihilistic. A lot of the topics in ecological spaces and climate spaces are really dark and nihilistic and can feel heartbreaking and scary and can make me really fearful. And this is sort of an antidote to that fear is to start to think about what I can dream. So I do, yeah. So ecofuturism is the practice of imagining the future that I want, and not just alone, but I collaborate a lot. So I do it with my collaborators too, and my students.
I love that because I'm a fellow futurist, and later down the line, I have a question about futurisms that I can't wait to get into. But I love how you approach through like an ecosystem lens because I think when I first, I'm really into water and I have like a water art practice, a water work practice. And I think years and years ago, I was really like hyper focused on water. Um, and over time, and I grew up near the Atlantic Ocean, in Staten Island, and I lived a little bit in Brooklyn when I was a preteen. But I over the years, I've been like connecting, oh, the ocean, connecting the ocean to rivers, and the rivers to wetlands, and the rivers to the mountains, and just sort of seeing that bigger picture of connections, interdependence, you know, thinking about ecosystems. And I still feel like I'd love to be in spaces that cultivate my like ecosystem awareness and way of moving through the world. So I just think it's amazing that you approach life and your art and collaborations from that perspective. Um, You write how your work involves making ecosystemic tools and experiments um, with different materials. So I have never heard of ecosystemic tools before. I have looked at your website and what you share on Instagram, but I'm very curious, like what are ecosystemic tools and what kind of materials do you experiment with?
So yeah, thank you. I also really focus on water too, so it's always nice to talk to another water nerd. I think water is like
Yeah.
the root of a lot of the projects that I've been really passionate about, and also it always comes back to water. whatever the project is, because everything requires it to live in varying amounts, obviously. Um, but and also too much of it is, the issue in New York is the sea level rise, is the big issue, or uh, the context for water in New York. Um, but ecosystemic tools, so it really depends on the project. Each project I do is research led. So I start off with reading and researching whatever the topic is. And this can be in a range of forms, whether it's through a grant or with a client or personal research, or for a class to teach. I start off with research, and then a lot of that research ends up being material research. So I make things to understand the topic better, and also to experiment with ways to respond to the research. So one example of an ecosystemic tool is a desalinator that desalinates water using evaporation and sunlight and a Fresnel lens. So this is basically a magnifying glass that heats up whatever it's touching, um, and you can use it for desalinating water through evaporation, which is a very passive way of dealing with desalination. Oftentimes, desalination requires huge amounts of energy and resources, and in many of the countries that are contending with low water levels and proximity to the sea, they don't have the capital or the infrastructures to desalinate that water and use it. So that's like sort of most of the countries that surround the Mediterranean. And then a lot of coastal communities around the world have this, this need for fresh water and the irony of being next to water that you can't use. Another example of an ecosystemic tool is, let me think of something that is very different. Um, or maybe I won't think of something very different. Along in that same vein, I have been working with an agronomist in Greece, Manos Bazanis, and he studies halophytes, which are plants that are that are saltwater tolerant and actually quite drought resistant too, and they grow along coastlines. And so together we've been gathering edible halophytes and creating a seed library to store these edible halophytes. And the idea is that this is, the future of food in that region. Even if it's not what people are investing in now, it's what grows there spontaneously and without added water being, water infrastructures being pumped in, or without added energy to create greenhouses. These plants grow very well in those areas and can be used for subsistence. So that's also another ecosystemic tool. So a seed library that's also small scale, so it's not centralized like some of these big seed libraries. Um, yeah, I could give you lots of examples, but I think that just maybe it's helpful to think of it as ways of responding to local ecologies through something often physical, sometimes more ephemeral, um, and something that might be a of use in that climate or that location, and something that's not extractive, so not requiring huge amount of energy to make. Sometimes made out of upcycled materials, sometimes made out of living materials. But there's not one definition to define it. It's really determined by where and what it's serving.
Gosh, my imagination was just taken off there. Because also when you speak, it really just at least for me, it churns my imagination. Like I feel like the ecosystemic tools and just the way you're speaking it feels like, yeah, inherently imaginative, or it It just I don't know, it feels really connected to the imagination. And I'm just like, oh, I would love to just have access to some ecosystemic tools. While you were talking, I was thinking about I have like a portable solar panel, and I'm just thinking of ways to like be with the earth, be in relationship with the earth that helps me live. And so if people could have that desalinator, I don't know if I'm saying that right, that ecosystemic tool to desalinate water, gosh, that just sounds so empowering. And I'm like, I wish there was like a store or like some place people could just go and get these tools. And you said something else. Oh, the seed library. Yeah, shout out to seeds. The existence of
Yeah.
seeds. I'm like, I feel like, people like we always need like a seed stash somewhere, but the halophytes, that is so interesting. So it's like you're saving these seeds for people to plant in the future, or to remember that there's also food on the coastline, or it's both.
It's both, and also to teach people how to gather seeds themselves and to recognize these plants as food. I think that the idea is that a lot of these tools can be made yourself. You don't need to buy them. Maybe, if you have, you
Yes.
need very little to make them yourself. And, we've been, as humans, and also other creatures, have been living in really harsh climates for a long time. So um, it's not new technology. It's a remembered technology, and I think sometimes we overcomplicate things, and a lot of the designs become very reliant on energy sources or big infrastructural projects when we don't need to do that in order to coexist in these climates that might seem, contrary to um, life in some way.
Well, now that you said that, I'm like, that's even more agency, to be able to make these tools.
Mhm.
Um, I don't know. I feel like they're like makers in my family.
Mm.
Like my aunt and my sister, I just feel like they're makers where they have this mindset where they'll see something or they'll see a project and they'll think about how to make that. And I feel like I'm not really that way, but I want to. Do you think that there is sort of a maker mindset, or does that make sense? Like there's a way of thinking where you're like, oh, I can make that. And then there's another way, which is totally fine, of like, I'm going to buy that. I don't know if that makes sense.
Do I think it's two different types of people? Is that what you're
Yeah,
asking?
or like different ways of thinking. Because I always wonder, how come I'm never like, oh, I can make that. I can make that. I just feel like the people I know who are like makers, they'll look at something and be like, I can make that. I can make that.
Mm. I mean, maybe it's different types of brains. I'm not sure. I also feel like I was really encouraged to make things from a young age, and didn't grow up in a home where we were like buying a lot of stuff anyhow. So it wasn't really the muscle memory, I guess, is also making things. Both my parents were very, very creative, and so like everything was made by one of us or a friend, or um so I think I have that in my history, that sort of like it's the first line of defense. It's like, oh, can I make that? If I can make that, then that's how I'll do it. Definitely I do buy things too, because who has time to make everything? And like I don't judge people for doing it one way or another. I actually just have fun building things and making things too. So it's also, I get pleasure from it, and you probably get pleasure from something else that's equally as important and creative and interesting. It's the language that I communicate best in is with making, I think.
Oh, I love that. Making as a language. Yes. And maybe, yeah, it's like a language to learn. And I totally hear you about like that being a part of your upbringing and how that's stayed with you as an adult. I mean, I guess I'm just really fascinated by making and maker spaces and just, I don't know, while you were talking, I'm like, yeah, so and so could have made my socks and so could have made my pillowcase. And it makes me think of like, local economies and supporting local makers. Um, I don't know, so much to get into there. I have a lead up to my next question. Unless you had anything else you wanted to say about making.
I think that also it's like, some people don't think they're good at dancing and then they hear the right song and their body's moving and it's like maybe it's what you might be compelled to make something at some point. And I think I don't know, maybe as kids we get put into a category, but I think everyone should feel empowered to do something with their hands and it doesn't have to be useful or practical. It can just be touching clay. You don't have to make something that is, that you feel like other people are going to recognize as well done or whatever it is that limits your sort of like exploration of things as we get older. It's like, oh, that's not my discipline. Um, but that's not true. We're capable of so many things as humans. Um, and like I never sing
Yes.
because I'm not good at singing, but sometimes there's a good song that comes on and I need to sing. I need to belt it. Um, so yeah, maybe it's just about feeling inspired to make something and also freeing yourself from the idea that it has to be like quote unquote perfect or well done or good or final or functional or all the things that are um, sort of what we the conditions and the aspirations we put on ourselves when we do make things.
Gosh, yeah, I love that. I just feel like you're really speaking about being free, you're free to make whatever you want to make and free to like sing whenever a song comes up and it's just about being free and seeing where you gravitate toward and
Mm.
I don't know. I feel like maybe a lot of people need to hear that. Maybe both of us just, it's okay to be free and, go with the flow. Um, so I have a little bit of a lead up to my next question. Circling back to being an eco-futurist, as I said before, I'm a fellow futurist and I love exploring futurisms. But oftentimes when I talk about the future, I feel like I've gotten a lot of pushback and, told in one way or another that it's better to focus on only being in the here and now. And sometimes which is totally important. And sometimes though it feels like people respond to thinking and talking about the future as like frivolous and something to disregard and disconnect from. And I'm sure, as we both know, people perceive space time in different ways. And for many folks, the future, past, and present are one and the same. I also understand like the importance of presence, and I love practicing being present. Like for my job, I feel like there's no other way I can be except to be present. But I also love futurisms. I love the
Mm.
future. So I like how ecosystem thinking is an integral part of your practice and makes me think of like how people have roles, multidimensional roles in society that help us live, like the school teachers, the nurses, the cleanup crews who take care of trash and recycling. So, what are your thoughts on the role of people who identify as futurists?
Mm.
Because we have a role too.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I I'm always interested in why people might be resistant to thinking about the future, because we all are doing it in minor ways all the time, whether that's like planning your dinner or planting your garden or planning a trip. You know, that's imagining the future, whether or not it's, you know, within the realm of, you know, a continued reality or it's a divergence from reality. Maybe we imagine, oh, maybe I'll be discovered on the street and be an actress in my later life, or maybe I'll win the lottery, or, you know, we can also have these dreams that are less probable, but we still can collectively have them. I mean, think about how many people play the lottery. In a way, that's all these people who are believing in the potential of their future. Um, I think I think that the role of people who are actively engaging with futurism and thinking about how do we project into the future is to um, consciously and carefully and responsibly start to determine or to define some spaces that might be better than what the people in power are imagining for our futures. And by better, I mean more equitable, more ecologically mindful, more collectively determined, more in harmony with natural elements like waterways or airways. Um, so I think that, you know, when we look at the people who have a disproportionate amount of power over our futures, it's important to say, okay, what they're doing is they're collectively galvanizing their energy to determine our future looks a certain way. And people like us who are coming at it from different perspectives and whose objectives aren't necessarily like accruing more wealth or uh, you know, some of these, you know, creating societies that benefit certain demographics of people over other people, we're already contributing to the capacity for people to imagine something beyond what's seems inevitable. And like no future is inevitable. Parts of our futures are, but I think we somehow count often count ourselves out of the capacity to define that future. Whether that's because we're not resourced enough to be thinking about the future, or it's because we can't imagine a future where our actions or our dreams have impact. Um, but yeah, I think it's also, it's an important exercise uh, in hope too. Not that hope I think is can be sort of a wishy-washy word, but I think it's important for futurism to be part of my practice at least, and I bring it into spaces because I think that otherwise we look at the parameters as fixed. So thinking about something like space travel, where when you imagine going to outer space, it's really easy to get dreamy, to imagine, okay, what are people wearing? How are people eating? Even something as mundane as someone going to the bathroom somehow becomes dreamy because it's so outside of our everyday that it's fascinating. But really, what people are doing when they're designing for outer space are designing a closed loop system where there's not any new fresh water. There's all resources pretty much are finite. And by putting the imagination into the space of, you know, out of our atmosphere, we start to get more dreamy. And you can do that too when you think about the future, when you take yourself out of the limitations and the constraints of the everyday. You might be problem solving or addressing some of the same things that you're dealing with on, you know, right in the now, but it's easier to free yourself to think more, to think bigger when you're not giving yourself the parameter of today.
Mhm. Yeah, I just feel like, yeah, it feels like I thought about movement while you were talking, movement, flexibility,
Mm.
um, and creating a space to think um, differently, to think of other times outside of today, of the now, which I think why I asked this question is that, like, I feel like it's okay to talk about the future, and that we don't, you know, sometimes I feel like people feel there's a loss when you there's a loss, or you're disconnecting from the now when you talk about the future, and I'm just like, it doesn't have to be um it doesn't have to be like a either or, that you can do both. And yeah, that example about space is really interesting. I actually haven't really gone far into my imagination about life on Mars or something. I mean, I think I'm I think I'm pretty comfortable with being on Earth. I like it here. We could breathe.
Mhm.
I don't mean, who knows what, I don't know. But I love that, yeah, it's this, it's like you're a guide into the imagination. Because we all have our experiences with our imaginations, whether that it's something a regular engagement, or maybe there are folks out there who need some support with connecting to their imagination. And it's really interesting how you connect the imagination and futurism. Um, I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on that, because I know that the imagination is like, it's not tangible until you do bring what you're imagining into being. Um, so I don't know, like, I don't know, what's your experience with your own imagination?
Um, huh. I guess it doesn't always deliver what I want it to. It's not always optimistic. Sometimes my imagination is pretty dark. I think that we can all probably relate to that, especially in moments like now where there's a lot of ambiguity about the future, and it just seems like many of the things that were being protected will no longer be protected. And it's easy to imagine that without those protections, the worst case scenario might happen. So my imagination doesn't always bring me into a space I want to be in. It's not always comfortable. It's always useful for thinking about how to be of service and how to prepare, but it doesn't actually free you fully from reality. It frees you from thinking that certain things are inevitable.
Mhm. Yeah,
And
yeah.
it also allows for play. I think that we can think about the future as something very heavy and something you have to plan for, but it's also somewhere where you can be a different, lighter version of yourself.
Yeah. Yes. Because that reminds me of when I was following this, like, spiritual teacher, healer, a while ago, but for some reason they're not active anymore. But they or maybe I did a session with them, but they talked about how, like, if you imagine your family members in sort of in a healed state. um I'm not going to articulate the way that they said it so beautifully, but it was going into I was imagining them, healed from their ails. And it wasn't necessarily about the future, but I guess that experience reminded me of what you just shared. But I resonate with that. I think our imaginations are alive, and they're they're responding to what's going on in our personal lives and externally in the what's going on a larger level. Um, so I guess it makes me wonder about how to, I guess, take care of our imaginations, you know?
Totally, totally. I think, yeah, I think that we, I mean, even in you saying that you're not a maker, or we give ourselves a lot of parameters, and we do need to take care of our imaginations. That's also a way that we can galvanize new ways of approaching things that don't fit us or don't serve us. And a lot of us have collective visions. So if we can galvanize our collective imaginations towards something that will make things different than now in a way that really serves people better than what we have today, that's when imagination is really useful. And also, it
Yes.
doesn't always have to be useful. It can be some a way of dreaming. And I love to think when I'm walking down the street that everyone has their own dream. And it can be little dreams like, oh, I'm going to make the most beautiful chocolate cake for my grandmother's birthday, or big dreams like I'm going to be the president, or I mean, that's probably fewer people's dream these days than before, or maybe not. Actually, that'd be interesting. I wonder if that's shifted for children if they want to be
That's a good
president
question.
more or less. But I think just remembering that everybody having is on a journey that's based off of dreams. So even if they don't consider themselves imaginative or futurist or free in a way, we all have these dreams that sometimes we don't allow ourselves to dream fully, and
Mhm.
that's normal because we all have real parameters in our lives, but there is something very human about dreaming.
Yes. Dreaming while awake in the sleep. I
Yeah.
love I love that. And I especially love the dreaming about making the best chocolate cake for your grandma. Like, yeah, you can totally have these everyday thoughtful dreams. I love that. I mean, I would definitely daydream about making the best chocolate cake. Uh, which that's actually a great segue into my next question. Um, I've gotten into cooking more over the years. I think for a long time I was always intimidated by cooking and um, just having different kinds of experiences around the kitchen and the power of being able to make a meal and all of these things. And so I've been so drawn to the meals that you make.
Mm.
And, I made a list of all these dinners that you made that I wanna ask about, but then I was like, I should just ask you if you could share a few stories, maybe 2 or 3, I'll just be quiet and listen. A few stories of foraging projects that you've done and meals that you've made in the past and recently. Yeah, just thinking about sharing stories of your cooking experiences.
Totally. So food is something that became part of my practice accidentally, but it's been part of my work for a while now. I started off in industrial design and environmental studies, and I felt like I was designing things that were talking about issues and conditions that weren't necessarily exciting for people to talk about or enticing to talk about, and were also often really dark. And I also, when I was younger, worked in kitchens, so I had a background cooking. And in one of my first projects that I did around water, I started off very going going to the, very speculative, large scale infrastructural design and was creating water catchment systems and imagining a future where clouds were bought and sold. And then I realized that it was getting too far away from the human and that I needed to bring it back to the scale of the individual, and that these issues around water or, concerns around fresh water scarcity were very human. And so I brought it back to the scale of the kitchen, and I made a few tools that you could use to prepare a meal without added water, and then recipes that use drought tolerant plants. And then I hosted a meal where that was open to the public for people to try some of these foods or alongside conversations. And it was such an epiphany for me that people were willing to talk about things that otherwise were really scary, or maybe people thought they weren't expert in. And people really realized how they were impacted by these conditions and counted themselves in a way that I hadn't seen before. And so now, alongside most of my projects, I do a food element to bring people into conversation. And it really lowers the barrier to entry. And everyone is a stakeholder in our future with varying degrees of power, but with very real stake in what happens next. And so this food component of my work is a way of inviting people into conversation who might not be in conversation with one another or might not be in conversation around these themes. So let me think of what would be an interesting story to tell about a food dinner or food meal.
I
Hmm.
have a list in case you need any
Yeah, I
nudges.
mean, if there's one that spoke to you, I can tell you about it.
Well, this one happened like 3 years ago. I have a couple that I wrote down, but I just thought this one, oh, okay. There's the eating la sin. Sorry if I didn't pronounce that right. The eating la sin. There's the dried riverbed picnic in Athens, Greece. Um, the cactus. I saw you did a project where you worked on a cactus dinner. There's the edible geology, and then the forging the tide line. So I had written those down.
Totally. Okay, so maybe I'll talk to you about the wait, so what was the first one that you mentioned? I'm trying to remember what that project is.
Eating la sin. It was like this beautiful, gorgeous dinner next to the
Oh, Le
river.
Seine. Oh, yeah. Okay. So yeah, oh yeah, the Le Seine. So sorry, I thought we have to switch. We're switching languages. We're speaking French suddenly. No, there's like the lesson in eating. So yeah, the Seine is the river that runs through Paris. And it's one of the only waterways within the city. And it's one of the few places where there's a bit of chaotic life in the city. The city is very controlled, very regulated life forms. All the parks are hyper manicured, very well cared for, but there's not much room for spontaneous growth. And so when I first moved here, I was feeling really disconnected from the earth itself that we were on top of. The city is definitely a testament to humans, and all of the nature or non-humanness that exists here is very, very contained. And so I started to study the Seine and do a few projects with it. And while I was doing those projects, I realized how few people who lived here had really spent time paying attention to it beyond it being sort of a backdrop for photos or just, a fixture, a landmark of the city in the same way that the built spaces were. And so I did a meal on the waterway that was in the on an island in the Seine that's publicly accessible, and invited a friend who plays the harp to come play music on the Seine. And then I made a series of dishes that talked about different components. So one was about the limestone and the walls that hold the Seine together. So the city is made out of a certain mineral that gives it this aesthetic, this sort of tan beige color of the buildings is is the color of the rock that's underneath. And the Seine itself is lined with limestone, and all these different plants grow on it quite well. And so one of the dishes was talking about that. There's also alongside the Seine, there's metal rings that signify places where boats were once moored. And so you can imagine when you start to notice them that this river used to be really busy and that there were people there moving around constantly. And it was really the main artery for trade. And it's not utilized now in those ways. And it really has the potential to be something that we can interface with. And then also thinking about how people are, I asked people who are at the dinner if they would eat something that was caught in the Seine because there's fish there, and everyone rolled their eyes or said like disgusting, definitely not. And then we talked about how they were afraid of eating something that was so local. And I asked people if they would swim in it, and people said definitely not. And this is before the Olympics where they attempted to clean it. But there was this realization when we started to think about that, if the food I was feeding them came from there, they wouldn't have eaten it, that it was a real tragedy to not, or to be afraid of something that's so central in your city, something that's part of your ecosystem, and to think of it as toxic is sad. And people do fish in it, and people do, I think they eat the fish that they catch, but I've seen many people fishing in it. But it's not a place that people think of as thriving. And I just think about how strange that is. So that was another component of the meal, was asking questions around people's relationship to the waterway, and then talking about some different species that live within the waterway, and what once lived there that is no longer part of the waterway. And it was the first project I did in a public space in Paris, and it was really surprising to me how resistant people were here to that type of work. People thought that it was invasive rather than generous. I'm used to New York. If you were to set up an instrument, people would come around and want to listen. And here, people felt like it was not. At first, there were some people who were very resistant to it. Of course, as soon as we offered them food and there was music, everyone got into it. But it was a higher barrier to entry in public space than I had experienced before.
It's amazing how food and music just I don't know. It's amazing how food and music kind of, I don't know, calms people down or brings people together or
Mm-hmm.
opens folks up to trying something. And yeah, that's really interesting. It reminds me of the Hudson River in New York, and I don't know, all the rivers that are experiencing some kind of toxicity. And I was living in on the Eastern Shore in Maryland, and I was just so fascinated by how people in the town I was living in, people got to eat the crabs right out of the river. And I was just telling everyone I was meeting, I was like, wow, you're so lucky that you get to eat the blue crabs right out of the river. And it just seems like so beautiful to have that seafood culture where you can
Mm-hmm.
eat safely from the river. And I thought that adding that harp was so beautiful. Like, it was just a vibe. Even just looking at the photos, I was
Yeah,
like, "That's such a vibe."
yeah, it was really fun, and it was a good time. And it just, I think, just, yeah, bringing people in conversation around something that's otherwise, you sort of take for granted, or you might not question. And it was really, I mean, it was really fun. And that's the other thing about when you work with food, is that people are having a good time.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's, like, Yeah, like you said, that's so interesting that you know, people were unsure about the harp and the the river being toxic, and then all of a sudden, the food is being presented, and I don't know, that just it reaffirms to me that, like, I don't know, just the importance and power of food, that, like, all of us, most of us, we eat, and
Mhm.
and that it eating together and cooking really can be a force for starting conversations and catalyzing all sorts of things. Also, the cultural differences are very interesting, of like how people would have reacted in New York City. Um, Whereas the responses are different in Paris. And yeah, I just think like just the different cultural differences around the world in response to art is really interesting. Um, so would you be open to talking about the dried riverbed picnic in Greece? That one's really interesting because I feel like for the time that I've spent in the Southwest, I've come across a lot of dried arroyos because of the drought and the climate and just the whatever's going on here in these arid lands. And I just thought, wow, a picnic in a dried riverbed. But I know that that one has like a whole context around that picnic.
Yeah. What was the word you used? The dried
Um,
what are you
um,
encountering?
the People here call the rivers arroyos,
Arroyos. Okay.
which I think is river in Spanish. Um, but yeah, I've actually been taking walks in this dried arroyo not too far from where I'm staying, and sometimes I imagine like having a picnic in that dried arroyo, which is really inspired by the dried riverbed picnic you did.
I mean, you should definitely have a picnic there. It's interesting to be in a place where water once was because you can see its imprint everywhere. So you should I highly recommend doing a picnic there. It'll probably yeah, and you'll see things on in the riverbed that you wouldn't have noticed it until you got into it.
Yeah, maybe I will, maybe I'll ask some folks if they want to join. Um, I'm just so curious, like how did that meal take place? If you can remember, I know that was a while ago.
Yeah, so that was yeah, I can definitely remember. That was not this last summer, but the summer before, and I was doing a residency in Athens, and the residency was all about water. It was curated by um, uh, Eleni Rika, who's a curator in Athens, and I was studying some of the waterways that existed in that city and realized something that people who live there or who grew up there know, but that there were rivers that had been covered and turn into highways and you can still and tram lines and you can still see the names of those rivers on as the street names and there's this hint and these clues to what was there beforehand but I wouldn't have known if I hadn't looked at maps and hadn't talked to locals who directed me towards this riverbed and I had a friend there who took me on a walk in the riverbed, and I knew that it was a place that I had to bring people who were not necessarily going to encounter it naturally, and to have a conversation about what the future of water is in a city like Athens that does have a huge amount of freshwater scarcity and stress on the water systems and had this opportunity to not have that stress, but relinquished it in favor of developing the city in a certain way. And so this picnic was in the riverbed itself, and I can share images with you, but the walls of the riverbed are this beautiful red clay. And I had gotten to work with some red clay while I was there and create a series of vessels that were responding to the textures and the sediment layers of the riverbed. And when you get into the riverbed itself, it's also full of life and also filled with pieces of marble. And so you can tell that there was a very strong flow of water because there's not marble factories that close to the city, and that at one point the water must have been so strong that it was moving these very heavy pieces of marble scrap down to the point in which we were having a picnic. And so you immediately start to imagine what the water looked like and felt like, and how vital it was. And so we had a picnic there. I dropped a pin. I just invited a few friends and told them to invite some of their friends. And because it wasn't super accessible and it wasn't something you would just run into, a lot of the work that I do is in public spaces. So there will be naturally spontaneous encounters, but this would have been really hard to find accidentally or to stumble upon. So I dropped a pin, and it was so hard to access for people. Nobody knew how to get there. It took a really long time for everyone to coalesce around the picnic spot. But once people did, we had these wonderful conversations, and everyone made themselves little seats out of marble scraps that they found on the ground. And I had made a bunch of different foods that talked about the different types of sediment and marble that was in the riverbed. And we talked about water, and I also had made the ceramics that we were eating out of. And it was, there's nothing better than being on site to talk about what you're considering. And a lot of people hadn't been there before. And so it was sort of magical to come out of off the street, off the highway, and realize there's this lush former waterway out of sight and alongside these quite industrial areas.
Wow, I'm just imagining like right in this moment. If we
Mm.
think about space-time, about the past, present, and future happening at the same time, I'm like right now you all are at this picnic on this dried riverbed. And if I say that, is there any kind of flash of a memory that comes to you? Like right now you're eating on that dried riverbed.
I think that it felt like we were gathering in secret. And it also felt, there was just an energy and excitement. It felt really like an adventure. And also, I have this feeling of how do you galvanize people to daylight the waterway there, and is that something that could actually happen? So daylighting, you probably know, but just uncovering the river to expose the waterways again, and have them refill and function as they did before they were engineered not to. So that's something. I mean, I felt a sense of longing for water in that space, and it's sort of like looking at an empty glass when you're thirsty. You just,
Yeah.
you want water in it. It felt like it wanted to be filled with water.
Wow. Gosh, what a combination. Like there's so much in this picnic, this idea just to like sit with and talk about. Like this is, just like a long form kind of remembrance of this particular memory and all the meals that you've made. And being here in the Southwest and mostly in Arizona and New Mexico, I've been around like different cacti and desert plants, and surely in New Mexico, all types of rocks and geology. And for a long, for a while, I would see some artists in New Mexico whose work focused on rocks, and I could not really get it until I got here, and I was like, oh, now I understand, because the rock formations out here are amazing,
Mm.
otherworldly. Um, I'm also curious about the meals you've made that involve edible geology and a cactus dinner. You call it a cactus dinner, where you like work with cacti, aloe. Um, there was another plant, I can't remember. Either of those meals you want to talk about?
Yeah, I haven't talked about the edible geology one for a while, so maybe it's fun to revisit. But that was a really fun project that emerged as I was in a space as well. So I was in Berlin for a residency, and I was I came there with a really clear idea of what I wanted to do, which is a great way to be derailed by reality. So I was biking around the city and noticing all these piles of different types of rocks. So things that were used for pavers or in building buildings that were being treated as waste. And to me, they were precious. They weren't processed at all. They were just literally hunks of land that had been imported or processed from a mountain that were no longer relevant to whatever the architecture was of the spaces that were being dismantled. And so I started to collect these rocks, and I ended up biking around with all of these uh, every single pocket I had filled with rocks, bags filled with rocks. And my studio, which was also, it was a live work studio space at this residency, started to have big piles of rocks in it. And I realized that that was my material. And so I made an oven out of these rocks and created
Oh my
a
gosh.
menu that was referring to these different rocks and their origins. And a lot of the rocks were coming from as far as the US, granite that was being processed on the East Coast. There were rocks that were coming from mountains within Europe. And they were a lot of these materials took so much energy and so many resources to first off mine and extract and then to ship or to transport, and then were being disregarded because they were no longer modern or they didn't fit the sort of smoothness of the textures of the ground that was expected in certain areas. And so I made a dish where each element was referring to a different part of the geology of this, this found geology or the waste geology. And we had an open day at the studio, and I mean, at the residency, and it was a very public space. The residency is in the middle of a public park. So all types of people came through, and we had many conversations, and it was really fun. And of course, when you're cooking things and giving away food, people are really happy. And it became a little party, and that was perfect. It was just a really fun time. And yeah, so I think that that is one of the examples of how food might tell the story less directly. It's not the food we were eating wasn't we weren't eating rocks, but it was whereas the projects that are talking about drought or uh, flood, I'm serving people flood tolerant plants or drought tolerant plants is much more literal. This was a bit more representative and playful in that way. And it was also part of the beginning of working on creating tools for cooking with. So I love making ovens and I want to make them all the time and just need more opportunities to. But I think it's such a nice place to gather and to create those out of things that you wouldn't necessarily see in public spaces, or a lot of our ovens are in private spaces now, but I love bringing them into public spaces. And the other thing that was really cool about this, the location of this residency, is that the neighborhood it was in, it's a neighborhood called MoMA. It's not a very central neighborhood in Berlin. It's not super trendy or something like that, but there's people come to this park with little stoves that are usually coal fired, and so, or coal powered. So there were, this park had already had a history of people cooking in public space and bringing their little barbecues or their little grills to heat up tea. And it was, yeah, so that was a nice tradition within the space to add to.
Wow, I didn't even know that you like making ovens. I'll be honest and say I have never heard someone say I love making ovens. It made me think about also your project, the Solstice Kitchen, which I thought was pretty cool. I'm like, I want to go somewhere and like make some eggs on a sidewalk somewhere and eat a breakfast sandwich. But like, what do you
Good.
mean by making ovens?
Well, I haven't made as many as I'd like to, but I had a bunch of plans for making solar ovens with my father, who's a fabricator, and then he passed. So that project is on hold, but I love the idea of creating hearths or places for people to gather and cook food together. You are in the perfect climate for a solar oven. The one that we used in Solstice Kitchen, we didn't make. That's a parabolic solar cooker, which is a technology that reflects the sun into a very specific place that is underneath a pot or whatever you're heating up. And it's one of many ways of cooking with the sun. And it's much more effective in places that don't have clouds or have full sun. And so I think that actually in Arizona or in New Mexico, you're the perfect candidate to play with a solar oven.
I'm like, I have to tell my grandmother quickly. All
Yeah.
my family members in Arizona got to get us a solar cooker ASAP, you know?
Yeah, I mean it makes so much sense to me as something that you would use in a place that's sunny. I think that Paris is not the perfect candidate for it, but there's lots of parts of the world that make perfect sense to have it. And especially if you're, not cooking huge batches of something, but it's less dependable than a gas stove or an electric stove, but you don't have to pay any money to power it. It's a free fuel source.
Yeah, when the longer I was in Arizona, the more I realized with all the constant sun, I was just like, this is just a place to develop solar power, like knowledge and skills, and just live like a solar punk life. Um,
Yes. Yes. Exactly. I'm wanting that solar punk life, but I live in a gray city. So it's for me, it's a fantasy for now.
yeah, it's really interesting like where you live, it determines like how you live because um I'm mostly in the Southwest because my grandma retired to Arizona, but it's like my whole body, everything about my life, my body changes when I come here because it's also so dry. So it's interesting how we change when we go to different places. You know, I don't know if you feel that way, like your if your body feels different in Paris um versus New York City, you know. Uh,
Definitely. Definitely. I mean, the main thing was the lack of sun. I'm so used to sun. And yeah, here it's just I think this winter was one of the grayest in history too. So people were feeling really vitamin D deficient. But it's yeah, that's the main difference. And for me, in terms of how my body feels, I'm more of a warm weather person in general, and I love spring and summer. It makes me really happy, and I feel really relaxed, and I have an anxiety around the winter. So it's, yeah, that's something that, I mean, we all react to whatever the weather is outside, and here I feel like the grayness makes me feel more existential and also closed and less social and all these things that I don't relate to, but obviously they're part of me, but it feels more atmospheric than it feels personal. I feel like everybody who comes here in the winter becomes that way. So it's, yeah, I mean, a lot of great writers came out of here probably because they didn't want to go outside in the gray, wet winter.
Wow. Gosh, yeah. It just reminds me of how like living everything is, or how animist everything is, that like the weather is alive, the atmosphere is alive, and it does impact like our, living fleshy bodies that react to all sorts of things. Um and yeah, it's also, why some places are more cloudy and gloomy and other places are different, and just how we change as we go to different places. It's so interesting. Um, the last meal that I wanted to talk to you about before, I have about three more questions left, but I really wanted to ask you about foraging the tide line. Um,
Mm.
was this the project where you were collecting seaweed and you were spending time at tide pools? I'm just curious about what that experience was like, finding food there.
So, Foraging the Tide Line is the ongoing project that I was doing with the agronomist Manos Bazanis, where we were gathering these seeds along the water's edge that are edible halophytes. And we did a series of events where people could actually try some of these foods. The first year that we worked on this project, we created a garden in which we grew the seeds, and so people could try them at the end of the month that I was there. We had a dinner, and then we also had some tastings throughout the month that I was there. Some of the stuff was foraged as full grown plants, and some of it was foraged as seeds that we then grew in soil within the space of the residency. And I think the seaweed project you're referring to it wasn't a project that I did. I was invited to Bretagne or Brittany in the west coast of Paris, of France, and I had never been there, and I felt so lucky to get to go there. It's a very I was just like looking up the video. Sorry, that was what uh, that background noise was. Just to, I'll send you images of it.
Oh
But
yeah, I'd love to see
with
that.
that was with Inland Academy, which is a school that's an alternative pedagogy that studies food and foodways. And I was invited by Grace Gloria Denise to come and talk about halophytes. And when I got there, she said, okay, tomorrow morning we're waking up before dawn to go catch the tide at low tide so we can forage seaweeds. And so that maybe what you saw was us foraging
Oh,
seaweeds
I see.
with someone there who studies seaweeds, but I had never eaten so many different seaweeds in my life, and it was amazing. It was I didn't even know that there were so many that were edible just right at our feet. And the agronomist who brought us around, he had us try ones that he said that smelled like truffles, like the mushroom. And so they're really pungent, and you're only supposed to eat a little bit or else it'll make you sick. But it was one of the most unique flavors I've ever had. And I will say that eating all these seaweeds on an empty stomach was not ideal, but it was really a joyful and magical experience. I mean, I love tide pools, and I grew up in in the Northeast where the water's really cold and there's lots of tide pools, and it felt really familiar, even though these ones were filled with life I wasn't familiar with, but I felt really good there. And yeah, so that might be the seaweed that you're referring to.
Yeah, that well, it's all so magical. I'm like a seaweed aficionado. Um,
Ooh.
yeah, and also I've been thinking of how I have to get to the West Coast to get to tide pools. And
Yeah.
and only recently did I realize that there are tide pools in New York. So I don't know, are there tide I don't know where you know, in the Northeast, where are tide pools? I'm like, do I just have to go to California to get to them?
There's tide pools anywhere there's tide. So
Oh.
yeah, that's, I mean, they don't all have as the same animals and creatures and plants that live in them, but
Oh.
in anywhere there's tide pools, and definitely not so much when you have these super smooth beaches. There's not places for the water to gather, but wherever it's rocky, there's little pockets of water that stay around for the tide going up and down and are home to these very unique ecosystems. And a lot of starfish live in tide pools, or sea slugs, or there's so many creatures, periwinkles, and we found so many sea urchins and abalone, and I didn't
Oh
know
my
that
gosh.
abalone were in France. So for me, I felt like it was so full of life. It was amazing. There were scallops. It was amazing. Mussels, and really beautiful to see the sea floor without the water there is also really nice. It feels like um, you're getting a sneaky peek at what lies below. And yeah, just being somewhere at low tide is such a it's good for the nosy part of me that wants to see what's living down there.
Oh my gosh. I feel obsessed about tide pools. And I when you're
Yeah.
speaking, I'm like, wait, I have been at a tide pool. I've been at a tide pool um at this beach. It's called Fort Wadsworth in Staten Island. And I'm like, oh yeah, I've been to a tide pool, but I guess I didn't think of it that way because I feel like my first me looking at tide pools for the first time or being introduced to them was like starfish and anemones.
Mhm.
And I feel like I don't see the I've never seen those type of creatures at the tide pools that I've gone to, I guess. So I never thought
Hmm.
of them as tide pools. I don't know what I thought they were.
I mean,
That's so
I think yeah, I mean, I guess maybe there's been like a lot of media about the tide pools in California that are very lush and have all types of interesting things living in them. But yeah, they're everywhere, and there's seaweed everywhere is the other thing. It's like this isn't. I think there's certain cultures that eat seaweeds that so we associate it with growing in those places. But I mean, there's plants everywhere in the ocean. You know, it's it's not just in certain coastlines. So yeah, maybe you'll also I think that you have to feel safe to go to the tide line. I don't think everyone feels comfortable around water. So I mean, I grew up really close to water, so I'm not afraid of it for the most part, but I think, you know, the idea of being on the water's edge might feel risky or not as inviting to in some places, you know, in an urban place like New York, I'm sure like in the city there are tides, but and I'm sure there's tide pools, but I wouldn't want to fall into the East River, into the Hudson necessarily. So I don't know how close I would be willing to venture towards the tide line.
yeah, I hear that. Because what you said made me think of like this one time I did go to Fort Wadsworth Beach, and the the time before last, I had such an amazing time, like seeing the seaweed and the mussels and the crabs, and it was just so magical. And then, but the next time I went, every time the or the waves came in, the waves would just bring so much trash. There would be
Mm-hmm.
needles and all types of stuff. And so, yeah, it's interesting. Like when you are at the edge, so much can come up, whether it's like you're afraid of drowning or you're, stepping on something. I don't know. Um,
Yeah,
but
I mean, I think a lot of these, like, I mean, a lot of these tide lines do also have a bunch of trash in them, and it hurts my heart, but it's real.
yeah, and I don't really know what to think about it because I was trying to swim and just be in the water, and I was just surrounded by trash. And so, yeah, I guess it speaks to like magical feelings mixed with
Mm.
trash,
Reality.
trash everywhere. Yeah. Anyway, I just felt like I had an epiphany. Sorry. Sorry if that's awkward. I'm like, oh, I guess I
No,
have been to tide pools. It's just that the ones in California seem so like people see an octopus or the starfish. I guess I want to see a starfish, a sea
I know,
star.
me too. Me too. I'm with you. I always want to see a starfish.
Yeah, and so I guess my question kind of got a little bit mixed up between the foraging the tie line and your seaweed adventures, which sounds amazing, and all the different seaweeds. So, as an ecosystemic designer and eco-futurist, maybe we've touched on this a little bit, but I'd love to hear more of your thoughts, however brief. Like, how do you feel about the state of the world right now through that perspective as a ecosystemic designer, eco-futurist?
Mm, uh, uh, I think that we're all collectively grappling with what the future might look like and watching a lot of the safeguards be dismantled. And so it already seemed like we had a lot of work ahead of us. And now the limits of that work are unclear. And I feel anxious, to be honest, with the dismantling of the ecological protection laws in the US because that sets the tone internationally. And I think that it's obviously very short-sighted and it's these laws are being written or unwritten and dismantled by people who don't understand how connected we are to the world that we live in. And it blows my mind, especially if you're a capitalist or that where do you think you're going to get your material if there's nothing growing,
Mhm.
if things are damaged? I mean, it's counterintuitive even to the capitalist agenda of infinite growth. And so I just don't know how we got to a place where it is so controversial and maybe unpopular in certain realms to treat our home well. I mean, it seems like a no-brainer. So I think I'm feeling anxious and angry and exasperated and also like we really need to pay attention right now to the ways where we can make subversive change and not rely so heavily on policy and governmental protections and think about what can we do as individuals that will safeguard ecosystems on a local level rather than at a federal level, and to recognize that this could be really bad and not to let that force us into a state of shock and inaction, but to have that galvanize us. And, if someone were coming to set your house on fire, you'd protect yourself and the house. And that's sort of what this administration is doing. And I don't like to talk about things in fear-based metaphors, which that really was one of. And I do think this is a all hands on deck moment.
I hear you. That's real. I really appreciate your perspective on this because I feel like sometimes the attitude is that from like, where would we all be without the government and the federal structures? Whereas like maybe there's less reliance on that kind of level of decision making um and power. Um so pivoting a little bit, I read on your Instagram that your father was a public art artist. Um
Mm.
and that you wrote on Instagram at some point that he's constantly dreaming new worlds, and it seems like you do something similar where I noticed you talk about dreaming up different realities with the students you work with. And
Mm.
I just wonder what that experience is like for you and if the way you've been dreaming has changed over time.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I was so lucky to have a father who was a wild creative force who always had ideas and exuberance and was making things and was trying things out and dreamed really big ideas that I think I'm still somehow not capable of dreaming. I still, stay at a smaller scale. And um, when he passed suddenly a few months ago, I felt this energy transfer maybe where he was passing the torch very abruptly. It wasn't the time for that, but it has happened. And this sort of seize life, go for it, dream big energy that he had, I'm trying to bring into my everyday and not limit myself with my fears or um, obviously there's real parameters of like funding and location and I think the material of life, but he really had a spirit that I admire, and he was just such a joyful being. And I mean, obviously with his own issues, none of us get through this life unscathed or uncomplicated, but he definitely, when he was making things, he was his fullest self in a lot of ways. And he did projects that were really fun. Like he did this one project that was called the Cake Within Cakes, and he made this giant cake the size of a house and then had it
Oh my
filled
gosh.
with actual cake, like edible cake. And then on New Year's Eve, for this big art parade in Boston, he had it drawn through the the park there by Clydesdale horses. So like those big horses with the white furry paws. And people were handing out cake from within the cake, and there were thousands of portions of cake for the public. And it's just such an absurdist project and so funny and generous and playful. And I just love that he did things like that that are, another project he did. And I think this is, I'm carrying on his legacy in some ways in the mentality of my work. I think that now we're asked to talk more about our work than maybe he had to. I think that there's because of the way that social media works, we end up, there's a lot of material around interviews and material around what creatives are thinking in their process. But he created this amazing space that was called the Trash Temple, and it was made out of the amount of trash that a family of four would have created in a year. And so the bathtub, it was basically a house, but the bathtub was made out of milk cartons, and all the furniture was made out of newspapers, and the
Oh my
columns of the
gosh.
house were made out of trash cans, and the walls were out of cereal boxes, and it was just so full out and wonderful. And I was probably 4 when he did that, and it made me feel like the possibility of making things was normal. And it also was fun. It was a good time. And he did projects like that throughout my childhood that were really, really inspiring. And I really miss him every time I'm making something, because we collaborated a lot, and he was also just such a good ally in brainstorming. Whenever I had a weird project, I'd call him and we talk through it, and he just was, yeah. I mean, obviously he's my father and I was biased, but there's just something, I mean, I am biased, but there was something so humble about how effortlessly he could come up with like the most brilliant idea in the room. And he casually had these ideas that, he never strived to be like a super famous artist, and he was more interested in public art, and he did a lot of work for schools and for playgrounds, public schools and public playgrounds. And uh, that's some of the work that I think he was the most proud of. But he could have done anything he wanted, and he just he just really, yeah, he just really injected his uh his bright energy into everything he made. So the other nice thing about his work is that I can still visit it, because it's in parks and playgrounds and in public spaces. And I haven't visited it yet because he passed away pretty recently, but and I don't live in the States right now, but I look forward to revisiting his art and his ideas, because they're just kind of magical.
Yeah, it sounds like he was just having a lot of fun. Just having a
Yeah.
lot of fun. Um, and I just think what a cool legacy, like this some sort of family legacy, or something that's being passed out, or the similarities between you and your dad. And it's just like it's really cool. And also that you can go and see his work, that it's still up. And I just really love that fun playful part, because yeah, life has its ups and downs, and it's just nice to connect to that element of just having fun and eating cake. I feel like now I
Mhm.
just want to go and eat cake.
Yes,
So
me too, actually.
yeah, but for real, I really am. I have to make this chocolate cake for my grandmother, and I'm just gonna have these memories of you talking about your dad and
Mm.
cake. Maybe I'm just obsessed with desserts lately, but okay, so
Me too.
finally, finally, thank you so much for sharing. It's been such a journey. More and more, I'm running into people online and in person who are including joy in their work.
Mm.
And I want to include more play and joy in what I'm doing too. So finally, is there one memory, um, one meaningful memory in your life where you experienced joy that you'd love to share?
Mm. I mean, I experience joy especially in the little moments, but I think because we were just talking about my father, the first thing that comes to mind is one of the last experiences we had together. So he was living on a little wooden sailboat, and we went out with two of my best friends who he knows very well, and we sailed as far as we could well, not as far as we could. We could have sailed way further. That's definitely not as far as we could, but we sailed away from the coastline. It was really foggy, and so we lost sight of the coastline. And as we were sailing, we hear this giant and we all turn around, and our hair is standing up standing up on the back of our necks, and there's a whale behind us, and very close, 10 feet away from the boat, so we could see it in full detail. And as we sailed around, we saw all types of whales feeding and, you know, uh, showing off their tails. And it was this trance that we all kind of collectively entered. And that was very joyful and spiritual. And I hadn't ever seen whales. I think maybe ever, maybe very far at a distance. And it's super humbling and also thrilling. And my father is such a creature of the water that I now sort of feel like it was part of this reclaiming of him into the non-human realm. We had all these different animal encounters, and right before he passed, a dragonfly landed on his arm for about half an hour, and all these little kids were passing by and they wanted to see it, and it was really joyful and funny. And I think that that for me was very joyful and poignant. Um, but I feel joy even when I have the sun on my face. I went outside this morning and it was sunny, and I was like, oh, how lucky. No problems exist when you have the sun beaming on your face like that after a gray winter. So I experience joy in a lot of different spaces, and I very easily experience joy too. I'm lucky, like having a square of dark chocolate. I'm like, yes, that is the
Yes.
point. Where I know we're talking about chocolate. We definitely need to go get cake together. Um,
Yeah.
joy doesn't have to be monumental to be important.
Hmm. Yeah. Yes.
The whales were kind
Totally.
of, to be honest. That was unusual, and that was like that's something I'll never forget.
Wow. Yeah, I just imagine their sounds and being so up close. Yeah, I
Mhm.
love that joy can be in these moments of like awe that is the whales appearing so closely, and then the sun shining on your face and being so warm. I was standing in the sun yesterday, and yeah, that feels like joy is accessible, you know? Like you don't have to wait for like this big event, but you can find it in the small moments. Um,
Mhm.
I'm so grateful that I got a chance to talk with you. Thank you for meeting me at the Through Line, Lily. Is there anything else on your heart that you want to share?
No, that was, thank you for such thoughtful questions. And I love hearing how you're thinking about things like futurism. And I really appreciated the care and attention that you put into the way that you treated this conversation.
Yes, so grateful and inspired and um yeah, thank you.